John and Darlene, I want to bring you guys into this because, you know, the three of us are tied to this so emotionally and so close to it. For someone who is seeing this for the first time, and your thoughts, John, on the movie and what it was about from your perspective.
Well, there were a couple of things that really struck me, and my hat off to Brooks for being able to do this, because I don't know that I could have done that with my daughter's murder, and having to reenact that. My hat off to you.
Thank you.
That was great. And also, this tells the story of many victims, the trauma that they go through. It's the aftermath more than the real act itself, because they live that the rest of their lives. And my daughter was murdered while I was on the police department here in Los Angeles. And it was by an individual who wanted to move up in the gang hierarchy, and he wanted to get into the Mexican mafia. He's still in prison, but I don't know if I could go through a reenactment of my daughter's murder. And I have been to many murder scenes. I worked homicide for a while, and this was after my daughter's murder. And I went on to work with the Board of Prison Terms in California, and that's interviewing those individuals who have committed those acts and trying to determine whether or not they're suitable for parole. And again, it's listening to more stories. But the thing that you talk about, and that is providing rights for victims, I think what you've done with this movie is kind of set the stage to let people know across the country that victims' rights are really important. We think of the defendants' rights, as you mentioned in the movie. We crawl over the bodies of the victims to make sure that we give the defendant his rights. And victims' rights does not take away any of the defendant's rights. It just makes sure that the victim is heard in court, and that the victim has a right to be at all those hearings and has a right to be notified. So to me, this is a very important film, and I thank you for doing it. You did a great job in the movie.
And John brings up a good point, Darlene. This, as much of a story as this is about the Douglas family and Brooks' life, and forgiveness, ultimately, and Christ and the role that played in your life and in your family's life, it's a story about victims' rights. And it shines a big, bright spotlight on that. And I know that's obviously something that's right in your wheelhouse.
Yeah, the movie is so vast. First of all, hats off to you that how courageous, not only this work, but what you did also in the state legislature. And it takes a very unique person to be able to take such pain and agony and so many trials that go with it, to take it to another level and help other people, because it's very selfless that you're able to contribute to and help others that come behind us. And it's such a great opportunity to highlight all that victims go through and how vast it is, and the financial issues that the family had, obviously the physical, the emotional, how long-lasting it is, as John's talking about, that people think that that you're going to get over it or get on with your life, and it's decades often for victims. It's lifelong, depending on the crime, and some victims are able to process it differently, and so it does turn into a victims' rights issue too, because as John's pointing out, that they go hand in hand. If a victim that hasn't had an opportunity to be present or be notified, even with when the inmate was moved from one place to another, and the victims weren't notified of that, or I always think about the speedy trial. The defendant has the right to a speedy trial, but there's nobody who wants a speedy trial more than the victim. We don't have that right. And in the 80s and 90s, we were passing so many pieces of legislation, which was a good start, and we did across the country. But we can't let up. I mean, there's still so much work to be done in making sure that those rights are enforceable, and that it's not just a piece of paper, that victims truly have a place in the criminal justice system, because it's a huge part, as John knows and Brooks, that it's a big part of their healing process too. It's just adds insult to injury when a victim's rights are trampled upon and they're ignored and not brought into the criminal justice system on the level that they should.
And Brooks, I know that was a huge part of your life and why you became state senator and wrote that groundbreaking legislation that we saw in the amendment. And that was true. That did happen. You know, just the stuff off the top of my head, because you and I have talked for so many years about, you and your sister. You know, you didn't even go to your parents' funeral.
Right.
You weren't allowed, and you guys were separated. And as you said, everything was put up for auction to pay for hospital bills. And you know, how much of this movie was, I want to tell this story, I want to talk about forgiveness and what my father was, but at the same time, how much of it was, let's shine a bright light on victims' rights?
It was both and. For one, it was interesting. We were talking the other day about after it happened, and after I left the Senate and left Oklahoma, I really wanted to put it behind me completely. I didn't want to be known for it. I wanted to start over, and many of our friends here in California had no idea for years that any of that had happened until they found out that we were actually making a movie about it. And but at the same time, it was something I could never really escape, and it would come up at some point in different friendships, relationships, and people just find out, and it's the world of Google where you can find out just about anything you want on someone, and so it just felt like there was more pressure. Also, I had noticed, there were several, to go back a little bit, there was one thing that triggered my deciding to take on this kind of legislation. And one was, and Darlene just sort of hit on one of the issues, there was a couple in their 60s, a husband and wife, that came in my office one day early on in my Senate career. And they had lived in a nice suburban neighborhood, and not a lot of crime in their neighborhood. And there were 3 high school age boys that broke into their house and beat them almost to death. And then when they were finally able to recover, they did call the police. The police came out. They kind of knew who these boys might be, so they were fairly quickly arrested. And then they were waiting for the DA's office to call them about testifying in a trial. And about 3 months after this had happened, they look out their front window one day, and these 3 boys are driving past their house. And and they said, well, they called the DA's office and said, what happened? Well, we thought there was going to be a trial. We were going to testify. And they said, well, they pled. And so they're now already free. And there's so many things wrong with that, but not the least of which is the fact that they weren't told anything. Mm-hmm. They weren't told of the status of the case. They didn't have the opportunity to speak and to give their opinion even of what an appropriate sentence might be, or just have any voice at all. And so that was one of the things that pushed me to do that. And then once I left the Senate and we had moved to California, I saw some of those things sliding back again, as Darlene and John said. But there's rights, but they're not recognized. They're on the books, and a lot of that is simply because, and most people don't know this, there are 23 enumerated rights for the accused in the U.S. Constitution. The Miranda warnings: you have the right to remain silent, you have the right to an attorney, you have the right to a jury by a trial in front of a jury of your peers. All those things. There are 23 of them. And in terms of the rights for victims, 0, nothing. And so as much as states try to do things and to provide rights to the victims, anytime there's any kind of rub between the rights of the accused versus the rights of the victim, if a judge, depending on their predisposition, their background, whatever, if they just decide that they want to say, well, I'm afraid that somehow here it might impinge on the rights of the accused, it stops. And that happens a lot. And so one of the things that I began to push for, I know John's been involved as well, and Darlene, have been to have a U.S. constitutional amendment for crime victims. And you look at the things that are going on today, the shooting of a school shooting in Florida. We have Las Vegas. So many things, and yet the ones you don't hear about are cases like ours. I mean, ours was known at the time because it was just so rare. But there are crimes, people are killed every single day. These kinds of crimes happen every single day, and things that we don't hear about. And my work, my desire, is to create an environment where victims of crime can have their rights recognized, because things like having a voice in the system are what allow people, to whatever degree they're going to begin to move past what happened and to live their lives. And I'm taking a lot of time here, and I apologize, guys. But I look at what part of what hit me, as we were writing this, and as a reason, which is back to your question, is when I think about what my parents would have wanted for me. Is it to have been angry and miserable, and to have my life falling apart behind the scenes, although everything looked great? I don't think so. I think they would have wanted me to live the life that I was born to live. Not only I wanted to live, and I believe that God wanted me to live, but that they wanted me to live, and it was to keep going. Not to, if I didn't physically die on that floor, that every bit of my dreams would have died on that floor as well. And so I think there are things, an environment that can be created that allow people to take those steps a little bit at a time. And so much of it is how that system that they're trying to operate within is more of what's happening to them rather than they're able to participate. So, okay, I'm done.
I wanted to mention, you mentioned the constitutional amendment.
Right.
Many of the states have amended their constitution to include victims' rights, and I think there are still 11 states that have not done it. But that does not give the victim a standing in state courts.
Right.
Because it needs to be a change in the U.S. Constitution, because that's where you find all the defendants' rights. If the victim has no standing in the Constitution, then the judges can do whatever they want when it comes to rights of the victims. So it's important that we get a U.S. constitutional amendment. We have been trying that for I would say about 12 or 15 years. It has been proposed many times. Every president has agreed that we need to have an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, but when it comes to Congress, they always divide among party lines because there is a large pressure group when we start talking about defendants. Victims have no representation in Congress. They don't have lobbyists. They don't have lawyers that are working the Congress floors. So unless we get a change at the federal level where we get an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, victims are still going to be slighted when it comes to being heard in court. And victims are not asking for anything more than to be heard for restitution when they've been grievously harmed. And those are the kind of things that they're looking for crime victims. And I think this movie sets the stage for that. It's something that I think everybody ought to see. I will certainly be telling folks that I know to go see it. And I think it's very important. So thank you.
One thing I often think about is that we can't go back and change a crime that's happened to a person. As much as we would all love to be able to do that. What is in our power is how we treat that victim going forward, and the rights that we allow and provide to them, or the services that we provide to them, because that's something else that's changed significantly since, say, the 80s, 70s and 80s, 79, I think, when this incident occurred. And the crime victims compensation programs weren't around back then, and we've done a great deal to modify laws across the country and provide more services to victims. There's still so much to be done. One study that we've done within DOJ shows that about 12% of victims that report a crime, people who actually survive a violent incident, 12% receive services that enable them to move forward with their lives and to heal, and whether that's victims compensation or counseling. There's just so many levels that we can help victims, and a lot of the resources are out there. It's just connecting victims with them, and the awareness, which anything that we can do to increase awareness is always wonderful. But we can do something about how we treat victims moving forward when we can't change the past, obviously.
And part of exposing that is a movie like The Amendment, and having that debate. And, I was going to ask you, Darlene, is, it seems sadly so timely to have this movie now and be talking about victims' rights, as Brooks was talking about. It just seems like it is such a topic of discussion, unfortunately, right now in this country. Maybe more important now than it ever has been in the history of this country. Well,
an interesting thing that Brooks and I have talked about too is there's often a lot of talk about inmates and criminal justice reform, and I think all of us here probably, I want inmates to come out of prison better than they went in. 95% will be released at some point. Whatever, programs we can have in place is great, but we rarely think about the parallel with victims and the struggles that, I was in college when I was a kidnapped victim, and I know Brooks, we struggle with, we don't get a free education, and which I'm not looking for a handout, but if you put the parallels there, the inmates, can get free higher education, and there's just so many programs that we just rarely look at the contrast and say, wait a minute, why are we doing this for one party and not the other? So many family members of homicide that I've known, and I've asked them, I said, how would your family have been different if you had been able to provide for those young children, your nieces, your nephews, when your sibling was taken away from you, that if you could have done that, could their lives have been better, down the road? And we just, our public officials just don't think like that, because the offenders often have the folks speaking for them.
So, go ahead, John.
There was one thing I wanted to clear up. I mentioned restitution, and I don't want people thinking that that's the most important thing that victims think about. Right. Restitution is probably at the bottom of the list. It's being heard, being able to be present when these hearings are going on. I know my daughter was murdered in 1979, and I wasn't allowed to be in court while the hearing was taking place. Nor was there any requirement that they notify me of any hearings that were taking place. So these are the kinds of things that victims want. They want to be there, they want to have input, and the input is not to determine what the sentence is going to be, but the input is to say how this crime impacted me. Brooks mentioned the financial things that they go through. I can recall when I first came on the department, it was in 1962, and I was a part of that system that when we took a victim to the hospital, they sent the victim a bill for the medical treatment, and somebody who was suffering from a gunshot wound and ended up in the hospital, they billed them after they were released from the hospital, and they had some of the best collectors in the world. The hospitals did. Right. So people lost their homes, and of course they lost their jobs and many things because there was nobody there to fight for the victim.
If I could, there's actually I have a clip, a news clip. If we're able to play that, it's just from our own story. It was news footage from right around the time of that these guys were caught.
Extradition proceedings have already begun to bring Hatch and Ake back to Oklahoma, but the suspects are in custody. 3 days before the Douglas family home in Okarche will be auctioned to pay the medical bills of the Douglas children.
Furniture, clothing, kitchenwares, books, games, a house. Some of the possessions acquired over a lifetime by Reverend Richard Douglas and his family. About 150 people came to bid, some friends of the Douglases, others strangers just looking for a bargain.
The father, Marilyn Douglas, watched, proud that so many people showed up to help his grandchildren, but quietly grieving.
It's just more than, you know, you can ever take.
The money, of course, can't make up for the loss of 2 lives. But for friends of the Douglas family in the Okarche area, it's a way of helping the best way they can.
When Glenn Ake and Stephen Hatch arrived in Oklahoma City early this morning in the custody of the Oklahoma State Bureau of Investigation, it marked the end of a 5-week search. A search that stretched from Louisiana to Texas, Wyoming, and finally to Colorado. The suspects were hustled off to the Canadian County Jail in El Reno. They'll make their first appearance in court on Monday.
So, I mean, it's exactly what we've been talking about. A lot of the financial impact that families experience when they go through this. And as John was saying, it's not so much about the finances. There are things that are extraordinarily unfair, and as Darlene was talking...
salt in the wound. It's like salt in the wound.
Oh, yeah, exactly. It's just you relive what happened because it's constantly back in your face again. And one of the things that I remember, and Darlene and I were talking about the other day, there was a young man, just as I was graduating from college, went back to Oklahoma, and this guy walked up and introduced himself, and his father had been an Oklahoma State trooper that was murdered by a guy named Monty Lee Eddings, and it became a very famous U.S. Supreme Court case dealing with offenders that were not yet 18, that they were minors, and that had committed murder. And I remember he came up and he was saying, "Yeah, you know, I'm going to college. I'm paying my way. I'm having to work a couple of jobs, but I'm getting through there." And you know, on into this panel discussion that I was on, and this guy was sitting a couple of rows back, and there was a psychiatrist that stood up and he said, I'm proud to announce that I work with Monty Lee Eddings, and he said, and I'm also proud to say that he has just completed his college education paid for by the state of Oklahoma, and that he's going to go to grad school, and he has just been moved from a maximum security facility to a medium/minimum security facility. And I looked down at the guy whose father had been murdered by Monty Lee Eddings, and he was just beet red. You could just see the furor in him. And I remember thinking, that's not right. I mean, and there's evidence that shows that there's less recidivism if these guys that are or women that are in prison get an education. So it's not like you want to pull that away or necessarily take it away, but what about the victim? You know, what about the victim's family? What about the fact that now there's no father or mother or whoever it is to help them and provide for them? And that's exactly what I did and went through. So, you know, there just needs to be fairness at the end of the day. As much as we can find it, there should be fairness in the way that the victims are treated vis-a-vis the person who commits these crimes.
So where is that, Darlene?
Well, and I think there's so many facets to it that obviously we're all wired differently. Victims don't deal with things the same way. Unfortunately, sometimes when a violent crime occurs, as we've seen, families deal with it differently. Spouses can lose a child and they deal with it differently. Siblings, and sometimes it's catastrophic and can drive a wedge in a family. And so and as John's talking about, what we want out of the system is different for each person. Some don't want to be involved at all. Most, I have found, do want some level of involvement, and even victims will go back and forth during their experience. Early on, they may not want an involvement, and then couple years into it, they go, you know what, I want to know what's going on, or they take interest in a parole hearing that maybe they didn't have as much interest in a plea bargain or a case. But I think it's a lot of publicity. It's a lot of just the outcry, and every year we host a Crime Victims' Rights Week in April, and that's been going on since '81. And that's so much for awareness, and people forget sometimes that it's Crime Victims' Rights Week. Yes, we highlight the services, yes, we highlight all that victims have been through, but it's about the victims' rights and that they have a place in the criminal justice system, and they should. It is a balancing act. I don't pretend it's easy, but we've tackled tougher things in this world, though, and I think we can find that balance and treat victims with dignity and respect, because we didn't choose to be here. We're not the ones who, it wasn't our choices that brought us into the criminal justice system, as you certainly know about Brooks and what his family's endured, and John and so many victims out there. We're just pulled into it. And
we still live in a country where victims in court can be kicked out of court if they sit there and cry during the trial. They will be kicked out of the court because that may have an impact on the defendant's trial. Those things should not happen in our world.